Right, so up until now, we've done some pretty basic stuff, right? We've declared variables, namely three types of variables, the string variable, and int variables, and double variables. And that's great. It's kind of solidifies the fundamentals of any programming language, figuring out what kind of data types that language supports and how to use them. Um, but it's really kind of boring. All it shows us is how to store data into variables to then use later on, which is great and really important, but doesn't really help us create any useful applications, right? It just helps us store information. Um, so in this session, we're going to talk about the Boolean data type. It's one last data type um, that will really form the fundamentals for building on top of your existing knowledge, and then being able to use if statements to then branch your logic out into specific functionality depending on the values of the variables that are in your code. So that probably doesn't make any sense right now, but you'll see in a second how important this really is. So like any other data type, like any other variable, we're going to first specify the data type that we want to use for this variable. And this new data type is called Boolean. Okay. Um, and don't worry about what Boolean means right now. We'll get to that in a bit. So we're going to name this variable just my Boolean equals true. Okay, so what we did here on line 4 was we created a new variable of type Boolean. We named it my Boolean and we set the value of it to true. So Boolean variables can only hold one of two values, either true or false. That's it. It's not like a string variable, for example, where like you can have its value be whatever you want, like whatever, it can be anything for a string. Same thing with an integer, right? If you had an integer variable, you can have it be 109. You can have it be, any number you want. With a Boolean, it can only take the value of true or false. Okay, so I'm going to actually create two Boolean variables here. I'm going to call this one my false Boolean equals false. And I'm going to change the name of this variable to my true Boolean and set it equal to true. Now, what I'll do is I'm just going to show you that if you want to print out the value of these variables, you can do so the same way we've always done it in the past videos. Just sticking them into system.out.println function and then running that, and you'll see that the values of the variables are true and false respectively. So if you just give us a few seconds, we'll see the values. Okay, I typed something in wrong. So system, yeah, mistyped that. Let's run that again. Now we should see two statements pre-printed out. One that holds the value of my true Boolean, which is true, and we see that down here, and one for the value of my false Boolean, which is down here. So they're printing out correctly. So what is this useful for? Well, Java has a keyword called if, right? And what the if statement allows us to do is run a specific snippet of code if the variable inside of these two parentheses is true. So to give you an example here, I'm gonna modify this a little bit. I'm just gonna print out a message before we enter the if statement. I'm just gonna do this is before the if statement. And then inside of the if statement parameter argument, this is called a parameter argument, by the way. Whenever you see an open and closed parentheses like this, it's whatever's inside of it. As of right now, nothing is inside of it. Are called parameter arguments. Right now, we don't have anything in the parameter arguments. And these two brackets here, they determine what the body of the if statement is. And the body is just anything, any code that's inside or in between the open bracket and the closing bracket. So anything in here is part of the body of the if statement. And again, the body is not even, there's nothing in the body right now. It's empty. But let's change that. So let's do um, if the value of what's inside of these parentheses is true, we want the code that's inside of this if statement's body to execute. And all I'm going to do is I'm just going to add a print statement here. I'm just going to do print line. Let's do inside if statement. So this line of code will only print out if this value is true. And actually, I'm gonna modify this a little bit just because just to make this a little more clear. So statement can have it be true, and I'm gonna change that here. Okay, now I'm gonna print out another print statement after the if statement, just so that you can see when the code iterates out of the if statement. So what's going to happen here? So whenever you run code, your compiler, your computer is going to be reading each line one by one from top to bottom. So when it gets to line 4, it'll create a new Boolean variable. It'll be called statement, and it's going to have the value of true assigned to it. So statement is going to be true. Now on line 6, it's going to print out the message, this is before the if statement, and that will always be printed out. And then when we get to line 8, Java needs to make a decision here. Okay, it's going to say if the variable inside of the parameter arguments is true, then execute everything inside of the body of this if statement. And as of right now, we only have really one line of code inside of that if statement, which is a print message or a print statement to print out the message inside if statement. That's it. So this message, this line of code will only be executed if this variable is true. And it is true because we set it to true up here on line 4. And then lastly, once the code has, once the compiler has exited the if statement, it'll print out this message. So let's run it and see what happens. All right, great. So what happened here? So we have 3 print statements showing up on our console. The first one is this is before the if statement, which is great because this is just like defined on line 4. This is before the if statement. That's a print message that we are always going to be outputting. And then we have the execution going into the if statement, where it first evaluates whether or not the statement variable is true. And if it is, it executes whatever is inside of its body. In this case, since statement is true, it executed this line. And we see that down here. And then lastly, we have a message that just tells us that the execution has passed this point and is now printing out a message saying this is after the if statement. But what if the statement variable was set to false? What would happen then? Let's see. Okay. So what do we have here? So we have um, line 6 being executed because it's always going to be executed because it has nothing to do with the value of the statement variable. But on line 8, Java stops and it asks itself, okay, well, inside of this if statement, is the variable inside of the parameter list equal to true? So Java stops and it checks for the value of that statement variable and it finds that it's equal to false. So it does not execute the code inside of the block statement, inside of this if statement. So what it does is instead it jumps from line 8 to line 13 because it notices that the value of this variable inside of that if statement does not evaluate to true, which means that it does not have to run this code. Okay, so it moves on, it just skips it completely. And so lastly, it just prints out this is after the if statement, and that's it. So as you can see, the if statement is really, really powerful. It starts to, this is a point where you can start determining what you want to do with the variables that you've created, what different logic you want to execute given certain conditions. In this case, our condition is determined by the value of just one variable. But in future lessons, we'll look at how to use the less than or greater than sign to determine whether numerical values are less than or equal to or greater than each other, um, and a bunch of other things that we can do with comparisons um, and controlling the flow of execution. So this is just a primer to get you kind of thinking about what you can do with if statements and introducing the final data type or final basic data type in Java, the Boolean, and then you'll be able to build off of this knowledge and implement your own and control the flow of execution.